Not many people might know this, but vampire content is not just the mainstream stuff like Bram Stoker's Dracula, or Salem's Lot, or maybe Blade and Sinners and Underworld. And it's definitely not Twilight. But since these are popular IPs, people often recommend the same list over and over and over, and I am here to change that. You see, while researching for this video, not only did I come across some really good vampire movies and TV shows, but also a number of crazy vampire comics. And all these entries is stuff that not everyone has heard of. Kinda underrated but extremely dark and disturbing. So without further ado, let's dive into the scariest and most horrific vampire content that no one dares to recommend. At number 1 we got...
Really?
Let the Right One In, 2008. Now, Let the Right One In takes place in 1982 in Blackaby, a suburb of Stockholm, and it follows Oscar, a meek 12-year-old boy who lives with his mother named Yvonne. Oscar had a miserable time at school because his classmates bullied him often, and since he could not really fight back, his anger came out through dark fantasies in which he would hurt them or even kill them. Needless to say, the boy was dealing with a lot of trauma and pain, and I must commend the movie for not trying to hide it or soften it whatever Oscar was going through, but yeah, he did need a savior, and a savior he got, albeit not the kind he or anyone else expected. One night at the apartment playground, Oscar met Ely, a girl who looked at his age and had recently moved in with a man named Hakan. Ely told him she wasn't a girl and said they couldn't be friends, a reminder that, whether in horror stories or unhealthy relationships, people frequently overlook warning signs. So obviously, Oscar became drawn to this new chick in the neighborhood mostly because this was probably the first time he felt seen by someone. And when you are that lonely, even a vampire might feel like your babe, and yeah, Ely was, in fact, a vampire. She had grown in mind but still looked like a little girl, and Hakan had acted as the one who killed people and collected their blood for her in milk cartons. And he did the dirty work for her so that she herself did not have to hunt. But then Hakan made a serious mistake and Ely was left alone to fend for herself. This was a turning point for Ely, and she and Oscar grew closer. And while she helped him deal with his problems, their bond took on a strange and dangerous romantic turn. And the film, when it ends, leaves you with one simple question: how much could love forgive? Carl Hedebrand as Oscar and Lena Leandersson as Ely gave controlled and strong performances, while Thomas Alfredson molded the film like a fairy tale, albeit one where blood turned the snow red every now and then. And I must commend the film for its balance. Like one moment, the film threw us neck deep into a whirlpool of fear and suspense, and then the next moment it brought us back to this very odd sweetness between Oscar and Ely. And the movie actually blends several genres like crime, drama, fantasy, and horror, but in doing so, it does not try very hard. And maybe this effortlessness is what makes it awesome. But yeah, even as a horror movie, it leaves you thinking, and asking yourself whether being human and acting human are actually the same thing. In 2010, they made an English remake named Let Me In. You can watch either, but I would recommend Let the Right One In. The Addiction, 1995. Now, The Addiction follows Kathleen Conklin, an introverted NYU philosophy doctoral student who happens to have a late-night encounter I won't even wish for my enemies. One night, a woman who called herself Casanova pushed Kathleen into a stairwell, bit her neck, and drank her blood before whispering something cryptic into her ears and leaving. After that, Kathleen started to change, and the usual vampire stuff started, like daylight became a problem for her, regular food disgusted her, and because she feared she might have HIV, she went for medical tests. But the result only said that she had anemia, which was technically true and also extremely unhelpful because the real problem here was not iron or vitamin deficiency, it was vampirism. She started having a very foul mood and even propositioned her dissertation advisor at her apartment before she stole money from his wallet after he fell asleep. Then Kathleen's newfound and frankly unsatiated hunger. It took over her more more and more. In the library, she met a female anthropology student and later attacked her at the woman's apartment. After that, she met an acquaintance named Black at a deli, left with him after she propositioned him and then attacked him on an empty street. Later, on campus, she confronted Jean, talked in a fractured way about guilt, and then bit her too. At this point, philosophy class had fully turned into blood theory, and nobody had prepared a syllabus for that. Things became more interesting when Kathleen met Pena, a vampire who claimed he had almost beaten his addiction and was nearly human again. But would the nascent vampire ever get fixed? Now, why this film is absolutely unique lies in the manner in which Abel Ferrara turned this into a bleak New York character study. Kathy accepted what she had become, and her old philosophy lessons took on a colder meaning, as she tied bloodlust to guilt, suffering, and human weakness. Ken Kelch's black and white photography gave the city a lonely, trapped feel, while hip-hop tracks Cypress Hill's I Wanna Get High and Joe Dalia's score created a strange mix of street life and dread. The addiction worked because of its vampire horror living inside the real world, like an addict among ordinary people.
And that's another thing about those movies. Vampires always have ladies.
Martin, 1977. Now, Martin followed a young man who looked like he was in his early 20s, but he claimed he was actually 84 years old. And how was anyone supposed to understand that? Well, according to him, he was a damned vampire, but the truth was not as simple as vampirism. In fact, nothing about Martin was simplistic. His method did not match the classic vampire routine at all. Like, he would not float through windows, turn into a bat, or do all that old cape and candle nonsense. Instead, he sedated his victims, mutilated them, and only then would he drink their blood. So yeah, if he were a vampire, he was a very unique, very demented version of one. And if he was not a vampire, then we were dealing with a young man whose mind had been lost to myths about bloodlust. Martin eventually ended up in Pennsylvania, where he lived with his cousin Christina and his granduncle Tatakura. Now, Tata did not trust him at all and called him the ancient vampire Nosferatu. Christina, meanwhile, wanted to save his soul, which gave the whole situation this feeling of pity, fear, and religion. A few days after his arrival, Martin fell for a local woman, and for a short while his urge to drink human blood seemed to subdue. But desire could not defeat the thirst for long, and soon enough the withdrawal hit him, and Martin fell back into violence. And once again, the story became this bloody spiral, where no one could really guess what would happen next. What made George A. Romero's film so damn good was the central question, or rather, the doubt, about Martin's vampirism. Was Martin truly a vampire, or was he simply a damaged man addicted to human blood? The film never handed us an easy answer, and that made it stay in the head. John Amplis made Martin feel strange and hard to pin down, while Romero himself appeared as Father Howard and used the horror to push at bigger ideas about reality, myth, and violence. Even after decades, Martin is still a good vampire movie, mostly because it makes us really think that maybe a mythical killer who drinks blood is, after all, not as different from real-life villains as we would like to believe. Firebite 2021. This 8-part series, co-created by Warwick Thornton and Brendan Fletcher, placed its monsters in Coober Pedy, South Australia, which the show renamed Opal City. And honestly, that location did half the work by itself, cause this was not a normal town. People lived beneath the ground there to escape the brutal heat, with homes carved into the hills, while the surface looked almost like bars, with its burnt land and crater-like holes. In the first episode, a local indigenous woman warned children not to get too close to those holes, because they could swallow them up. But the real danger was not the holes, it was what lived under them. The vampires had been around for centuries, and Opal City had become their perfect place because sunlight, their old enemy, was not much of a problem underground. Classic vampire rules like wooden stakes and all were still very much applicable, but then this story added its own flavor too to the vampire business, because here, a boomerang to the heart could also take one down. The story followed Tyson, played by Rob Collins, and his adopted daughter, Shanika, played by Shantae Barnes-Cohen. Their fight was not only personal, it was cultural and political too. In this world, vampires arrived in Australia with the First Fleet, then murdered Aboriginal people and seized their land. Since then, a war had gone on between the bloodsuckers and black vampire hunters known as blood hunters. The hunters had wiped out almost all of them except one. That last one was the king, played by Colin Mulvey. And he came to Opal City because, for vampires, this dusty underground world was basically paradise. His arrival disturbed the routine Tyson and Shanika had built, where they moved between the surface and the hidden world below while trying to keep their mob safe. Directed by Fletcher, Tony Kravitz, and Thornton, Firebite did well to build itself up from the ground, and focused on the human side more at the beginning, showing only enough vampire scenes to keep the interest peaked. Thornton had filmed in this land before with his 2005 short The Old Man and the Inland Sea, and here, the place had a rocky, somewhat grimy, boxed-in feel, and that worked in favor of the project. Like, you don't always need a postcard-worthy location for vampire stories, I believe. Anyway, the dim light, the junkyard-like texture, the dry humor, and of course the rhythm made it much cooler and more intense than it had any right to be. And after the first 3 episodes, it was still hard to guess whether it would end in a normal way or take some stranger road, which, let us be honest, suited Opal City perfectly. Chapelwaite, 2021. There are very few constants in the world, and one of them is a good Stephen King adaptation. Chapelwaite was made at a time when Stephen King film adaptations had been frequent, but his TV adaptations had not exactly had the same luck. Castle Rock did not do so well, while The Stand and Lacey's Story were also more or less misfire. It was under these circumstances that this 10-episode series premiered on Epix on August 22, 2021, and it took its base from King's short story, Jerusalem's Lot. But you must note, this was a very loose take. The original story had a very Lovecraft plus Edgar Allan Poe mood and setting, and used letters to tell a more secluded tale, mostly set around a creepy house and a small cast. Chapelwaite expanded that into a wider ensemble, and although it might seem like many of the added people were not as effective as the main family of the story, that does not diminish the value of Chapelwaite as a vampire story. The story is about Charles Boone, played by Adrian Brody, who is a grim sea captain who has lived for years on his ship with his wife and children. His kids, played by Jennifer Enns, Serena Gulumgus, and Ian Ho, had spent their whole lives at sea. After his wife died, the family fell into grief, and the burial at sea gave the series one of its strongest early scenes. Then the Boones moved to Preacher's Corners in Maine, where Chapelwaite, their ancestral home, waited for them. The house had belonged to Charles's dead cousin Stephen, but the town clearly had no love for the Boone name, and the story kept getting darker and darker from this moment forward. You see, the town was filled with racism and xenophobia since Charles's children were of mixed race, and their mother had been Polynesian from the Marquesas Island. Charles also had to bear the brunt of these evils. Inside the house, Charles heard rats in the walls, though an exterminator found none. His childhood trauma returned, his fear of madness grew, and then came the worms, so many of them. The show also had the very strong character of Rebecca Morgan, played by Emily Hampshire, who served as the governess, but she also planned to write about Chapelwaite for The Atlantic. Over time, she grew attached to the family, though her character often felt too modern for the world around her. The series had a strong gothic mood, fine dread at first, and a real link to Salem's Lot through its prequel roots. The Strain TV series 2014 to 2017. Now, The Strain is probably the last good show from the basic cable and network television era. We had shows like Hannibal, Bates Motel, and finally this great vampire series, before horror more or less started its dance toward platform exclusives and app-based releases. The interesting thing about Strain is that the show had a strong first and second season. Then the third season dipped a bit, but Carlton and Hughes managed to bring the former glory back in season 4, and what helped its cause was that it had the novel trilogy by Guillermo del Toro and Chuck Hogan to adapt from. Hogan, by the way, also wrote Prince of Thieves, which ultimately went on to become The Town. And if you think about it, The Strain is one of the good vampire shows that is based on a novel series, which meant that the creators did not have to scratch their heads coming up with story arcs, and they could invest their time and effort into simply elevating the horror and the visual appeal. The two main pillars that greatly helped The Strain stand strong were the fine story and, second, the really efficient special effects. And since Guillermo del Toro helped create and oversee it, the quality further improved. The books were over 1,000 pages combined, and they contained a story that was equal parts crime thriller energy and a pulpy vampire stuff. And as for the practical side, there was some serious talent that brought the various monsters to life. Sean Sansom, who ran makeup, also worked on Pennywise's makeup in It and It Welcome to Derry, along with The Shape of Water and Nightmare Alley. Special effects supervisor Jathan Detheridge had previously worked on some really good IPs like Crimson Peak, The Shape of Water, and Hannibal, while Patricia Larman, who handled set design, also has pointers like Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark and Guillermo del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosities on her resume. So when the strain threw at us stuff like decapitated heads, bloodthirsty worms, and bodies split in two and often more parts, it all felt very, and I mean very, real. And of course there's the unique vampire lore. I mean, there still were some of the classic vampire rules, sure, like there were coffins filled with soil and the usual fear of sunlight. But the vampirism itself was caused by a virus, and the virus itself spread through parasites and blood. Additionally, these vampires were beyond biting the necks of their victims, and instead a proboscis shot from their mouths which directly struck the victim's vein to drain them of their blood, which more often than not resulted in death. And since New York City was the starting point, which we know is super populous for a city, you got the feeling that this ancient curse had the telltale signs of a medical emergency or an endemic. Then there was Abraham Satrakian as the Van Helsing type hero, the Master as the fill-in for Dracula, and Sean Astin as Renfield from Dracula Stories. And it was the combination of all these elements that made the strain one of the best vampire IPs ever. Batman, Vampire, the Red Rain trilogy, DC Comics. Batman already dresses like, well, he dresses like a bat. And the Batman and Dracula trilogy consists of 3 arcs, namely Batman and Dracula Red Rain, Batman Bloodstorm, and Batman Crimson Mist. And it ran from 1991 to 1998. In Batman and Dracula Red Rain from 1991, Batman had been investigating a string of murders where homeless people in Gotham had their throats cut. And it did not take a long time for this world's best detective to find out that Count Dracula and his vampire family had been behind these murders. But the thing is, not every vampire served Dracula. For instance, there was Tanya, a rogue vampire who chose to help Batman and do what's right, even if it meant going against her own kind. But the manner in which she offered such help was slightly obnoxious. So she came to the Caped Crusader in his sleep and bit him, which gave him vampiric strength. But since Batman was Batman, he managed to retain much of his humanity. Tanya also told the Silent Guardian that Dracula's own vampires were weak against her kind of power, which only meant that Batman finally had a real chance at beating the shit out of Dracula and his minions. He then lured Dracula's followers into the Batcave, while Tanya and her allies kept them busy. Next, he detonated explosives, which destroyed Wayne Manor but also took out the vampire. After that, he fought Dracula in the air and impaled him on a wooden utility pole. But Dracula had drained the last of Batman's blood before death, and this meant that Bruce Wayne was now physically dead, but that did not mean he was gone. You see, now he was a complete vampire. The second part of the trilogy, that is Batman Bloodstorm, was released 3 years later in 1994. In Bloodstorm, Joker took control of what remained of Dracula's horde. With those vampires, he seized most of Gotham's major crime families, but Batman fought him back along with Catwoman, who had become a werecat after a werewolf attack. These two also had the support of Gordon, Alfred, and some of the best vampire hunters from the Gotham City Police Department. They destroyed the horde, but Joker killed Catwoman after she took a crossbow bolt that was actually meant for Batman. But this pissed the hell out of Batman, and he drained Joker, but also staked him so that he could not return as a vampire. But Batman was now horrified by what he had done and asked Gordon and Alfred to stake him too. Then came the third and final part of the trilogy in 1998. In Batman Crimson Mist, Gotham had fallen victim to an acute and absolute crime wave now that Batman was gone. Gordon then asked Alfred to remove the stake so that Batman could return and save Gotham from the peril. But the Batman that returned had gone mad because of the decay he suffered while he was staked, and now he had an unquenchable bloodlust. He hunted criminals and members of his rogues gallery, including Penguin, Riddler, Scarecrow, Poison Ivy, and Black Mask. But when the hero becomes the villain, it's often seen that the villain becomes the hero. So Two-Face and Killer Croc join Gordon and Alfred to stop him. And despite being who they were, both Two-Face and Killer Croc knew that the old Batman would have never wanted this. But it was all a ruse because the two villains soon showed their true colors and betrayed the others, which is when Alfred gave Batman his blood and he managed to kill both villains. But in the end, Batman realized that his soul was now lost, so he walked into the sun and turned to dust, hoping that the monster inside him would finally find peace, or at least perish.
Derek, what are you doing? Derek, you're freaking me out right now. Just stop!
Afflicted, 2013. Now, Afflicted follows two best friends, Derek and Cliff, who decide to travel the world and live like there was no tomorrow. But the thing is, Derek was suffering from this disease called cerebral arteriovenous malformation, and it could kill him at any moment. So there was a real possibility that he did not have a tomorrow. The two made a stop in Barcelona where Derek met Audrey and told her about his disease. The two ended up together for one night, but later, Cliff found Derek bitten and covered in blood. But they had an itinerary to follow and a schedule to maintain. So the next morning, they left for Italy, and that was where Derek's body began to change, and of course, the transformation, or the mutation, whatever you want to call it, was horrible. Furthermore, sunlight started to burn him, and over the next few days, he gained superhuman strength and stamina. Then, after a brawl, Derek beat a man real bad and licked the blood off his own hands. And this was the light bulb moment for Cliff, who now understood that Audrey had not given his friend a regular one-night stand. She had given him more than carnal knowledge. She had given him vampirism. But Derek had not necessarily become evil, so the two friends tried different ways to feed Derek's hunger for human blood, and their attempts took them to some ugly places, like really ugly places. They killed pigs and even attacked ambulances, but none of these were sustainable solutions. So their only hope for getting Derek rid of his affliction was to find Audrey, but that was going to be difficult. And even if they found her, would she help? Now, as a found footage horror film, Afflicted did its job very well. This subgenre had become so overused that many films forgot why they were using the camera in first-person perspective. And I would go as far as to say that the genre was dying and was only revived by Afflicted. But Derek Lee and Cliff Prowse, who played Derek and Cliff and also wrote and directed the film, used the point-of-view style with great skill, and it was evident that they knew what they were doing. You did not only want to know what would happen next, but you also wanted to know how the camera would catch it, from whose angle, and from what distance. Most vampire films resort to dealing with people who hunt vampires, or vampires who take revenge. This one, however, focused on the process of a human turning into a vampire, and if you think about it, the change would be a grotesque and uneasy one. Despite all that power and immortality, can you imagine the insane lifestyle changes you'll have to make if you turned into a vampire? But Afflicted captures that almost perfectly, and should be on the watch list of any horror fan. Baltimore comic. Lord Henry Baltimore was a man who had survived the First World War and the plague that came after it, and life hadn't really been easy for him. But Baltimore could sustain all this and more, but what hurt him the most was the taking away of his family by a foul, cruel creature of the night, after which Lord Baltimore had a singular agenda. He wanted revenge. Lord Baltimore then started chasing that foul, evil creature with a mental resolve that almost felt inhuman. His path took him through bloody battlefields, submarine graveyards, and ruined plague ships, often making him stand before deadly creatures who could kill in an instant. But Lord Baltimore kept moving forward. Created by Mike Mignola and Christopher Golden, the Baltimore series actually began with an illustrated novel called Baltimore, or The Steadfast Tin Soldier, and the Vampire in 2007. From that comic itself, there was a clear Moby Dick feel to the story, except Baltimore's pale target could actually talk back, mock him, and take pleasure in staying one step ahead of him. The real strength of the comic comes from the reason behind Lord Baltimore chasing the vampire Hygus. And oftentimes, the darkness was sourced not in the evil creatures and the vampires, but Lord Baltimore himself, who had somewhat lost himself after losing what was dearest to him. But even then, he could not stop because he had a duty he believed he had to finish. Many times he came painfully close to his prey, but then people in need or some other crisis pulled him away for long enough that the creature created more distance between himself and his hunter. But yeah, none of this carrot and stick approach feels repetitive or tiresome to the reader at any point. In fact, it only births hope in the reader, always making them feel like maybe this Baltimore would finally catch the bastard. It's a 496-page book, but trust me, you'd still want more, and that's probably the best compliment I can offer this book. Thirst, 2009. Thirst is about Sang-hyun, a devoted Catholic priest who had not limited his faith to prayers and rituals, and the man also served people in whatever way he could, like any way he could. In that same spirit of simple life and higher purpose, he volunteered for vaccine trials against a deadly virus. But the experiment went south and Sang-hyun died. Then, after a blood transfusion, he came back to life and recovered at an abnormal speed. But this was less miracle and medical science and more vampire business. Now, because Sang-hyun had already earned a great deal of respect for his service and faith, people started flocking to see him, and he became something of a holy healer. Thousands came to him, and among them were his old friend Kang-woo and Kang-woo's wife, Tae-ju. But our fallen priest and newly made vampire started feeling a physical pull toward Tae-ju, and soon he learned that his condition not only created an unquenchable thirst for blood, but it also awakened his insatiable hunger for physical intimacy. And this was not exactly ideal for a priest who had built his life around restraint. But then Tae-ju told the ever-horny vampire priest that her husband Kang-woo often assaulted her, and the two crossed the line completely by killing him. And after doing the deed, Sang-hyun also converted Tae-ju as well, and from that point onwards, the film entered a dark place where desire and righteousness became two black holes, pulling him and breaking his psyche. Basically, the man had to choose between the soul he wanted to save and the urges he could no longer control. Loosely based on Emile Zola's 1867 novel, The Risrakin, Park Chan-wook's Thirst is great as a vampire film, sure, but it is also a great drama about tropes like passion and irony, along with the really subjective concept of sin. The film begins as a spiritual experiment, but then transforms itself and goes into the field of body horror and intimacy, before finally making a turn to serve itself as one of the greatest examples of poetic justice seen in cinema. But yeah, despite all this, Thirst remains a vampire film through and through. So yeah guys, that was all in this one. If you liked the video, please consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Those two small clicks from you will help us tremendously in bringing you more of these awesome videos. Stay safe and have a good one.